In the future, you buy a cup of coffee. You lose 4 minutes of life. A cab ride takes 2 hours off your life. A stay in a luxury hotel takes a year off your life. It's a world where life is the currency of circulation. Every person from birth, there's a timer on your arm. You can only live until you're 15 years old. If you want to live longer, you have to work hard to earn time. The main character, Carl, is an ordinary wage earner. The time he earns each day only lasts until the next day. But even though life was so bad, before his mother's 50th birthday, he spent 5 hours buying a bottle of wine. On his way to work, a lot of people died on the streets because they ran out of time. Carl had seen it all before. Another day at work before he knew it. But when the paychecks came in, the supervisor deducted a portion of his paycheck. In the face of such unfair treatment, Carl could only suffer in silence. If he loses his job, he might not live to see tomorrow. After work, he went to the bar. A friend told him there was a guy across the street who was very high profile. He's been buying drinks all night, and he had over 100 years on his hands. Carl kindly warned him not to show off his wealth here. Otherwise, he'd get himself killed. Before he could finish his sentence, the time bandit broke in. He was surrounded by several people. The rich man asked to go to the bathroom. The time bandit was afraid that he would escape, so he followed him. At that moment, Carl stepped out from the shadows and saved the tycoon. Eventually, the two of them hid in a rotten building. They talked to each other and found out that the rich man's wife died not long ago, and she had lived for more than 100 years. Because life was getting boring, finally she chose to end her life. Without his wife's company, the rich man became more and more lonely. For a while, he wanted to leave this world. Then he told a harsh truth. 90% of the time, the rich are in control. They control market prices. They keep wages at a minimum. The lower classes have to work their asses off to survive. By squeezing the time out of the underclass, the rich have achieved immortality. Carl was shocked. Suddenly, the rich man asked the unthinkable question. If you had 100 years of time, what would you do with it? Looking at the little time on his arm, Carl said firmly, I wouldn't waste a second of it, and help those in need. The rich man gave him a silent look, and then the two of them fell asleep. When they woke up the next day, the tycoon was nowhere to be seen, and the time on Carl's arm was an extra 100 years. Seeing the window, don't waste my time, Carl realized everything. He went to the window and saw the tycoon was sitting on the edge of the bridge. He realized something was wrong. He ran towards the bridge. The tycoon had only 3 seconds left on the clock. As the seconds counted down, soon he was in the water. By the time Carl got there, it was too late. The moment was caught on camera, and it's going to get him into a lot of trouble. After leaving, Carl found his best friend Jack. He gave him 10 years of his life, and then he told him the truth. Carl said he could finally take his mother to live in a rich neighborhood. That night, he bought a bouquet of flowers to surprise his mother, until he waited for the last bus, but there was no sign of his mother. Carl realized something was wrong, rushed to his mother's workplace. Turns out his mother had only an hour and a half left, and the price of the car suddenly doubled. She couldn't afford to pay the fare in the time she had left. Mother tried to beg the driver to pay at the stop, but the driver refused, and none of the passengers were willing to help. In desperation, Mother had to get off the bus and run home. It would take at least 2 hours to get home. On the way, she tried to ask for help, but no one was willing to help. Time was running out, and then, in a moment of desperation, she finally saw her son. It was then that Carl seemed to realize what was happening. He started to run towards his mother, but in the end, he was too late. He saw his mother die in his arms. At that moment, Carl was desperate. He vowed to make the rich man pay. The next morning, he took a cab to the rich man's neighborhood. What Carl didn't expect, the toll alone would take years. It was clear that it was almost impossible for the lower class to break through the ranks. When he arrived in the rich neighborhood, Carl couldn't help but run. Passers-by thought the man was strange. They were looking at him differently. Realizing that something was wrong, Carl stopped immediately. To prevent his identity from being exposed, he went to the most luxurious hotel in the rich district. He booked the most expensive suite. Carl's method of getting back at the rich was simple, by winning all their time. After dinner, he went to a casino. After playing a few games in a regular game, he had over 100 years of time on his hands. Soon he was invited to the high end of the game. The man across the table had over 9,000 years of time. He was well known in the rich neighborhood. Seeing that Carl's face was rusty, the man was ready to show him a thing or two. He began by betting on 50 years of time. Carl was not shy about it. He went straight for 50 years. Then a girl came and sat next to the man. It turned out to be his daughter. Carl was shocked. She always emphasized the survival of the fittest. Then she raised the stakes to 200 years. She tried to scare the young man away. What she didn't expect was, Carl had all the time in the world, leaving only 30 seconds to open the cards. The father and daughter were shocked by this madness, but in the end, Carl won the bet. At this moment, his time has changed to more than 1,000 years. Through this bet, the man was completely impressed by Carl's vigor, so he introduced his daughter to him and invited him to a party on the weekend. On the day of the party, he spent 60 years to buy a luxury car. The man was already at the door. He introduced Carl to his mother-in-law and his wife, and through the dancing, Carl and his daughter, Laura, became attached to each other. The conversation grew more and more interesting. It wasn't long before Carl took Laura to the beach. He took off his clothes and jumped into the water. What happened next was unspeakable. Seeing that his daughter had returned safe and sound, the men invited Carl to continue playing cards. But then the police burst in. They locked Carl in his room without saying a word. It turns out that they found the body of the tycoon under the bridge. According to the scene surveillance, Carl is a major suspect. At this moment, Carl is very calm, because the tycoon gave him the time. He didn't do anything illegal. The sheriff thinks that's ridiculous. Only a poor man would murder a rich man for his time. It's impossible for a rich man to kill himself. He stopped listening to Carl's explanation. He ordered his men to confiscate his time. Only 2 hours were left. Obviously, this was a death sentence. Carl decided to fight back. He took advantage of his men's weakness. He made a decisive move and knocked them to the ground. Then he jumped off the building and fled. He ran into Laura and took her hostage. He drove the luxury car and ran away. The sheriff is also not a vegetarian. He chased after her in his police car, but he completely underestimated Carl's driving skills. It didn't take long to lose him. Carl had only an hour left on the clock. He begged Laura to help him, but she refused. She didn't think Carl was sincere enough. After Carl's repeated pleas, Laura relented. She gave him some time. Then the two of them went on the run. Unexpectedly, they encountered a trap on the way. They couldn't control the car. The car rolled off the cliff. Both of them fell unconscious on the spot. The time bandits arrived later. They realized that Laura had 10 years of time in her hand, so they transferred it to their own hands. At that moment, a police siren came out of nowhere. The time bandits left in a hurry. Soon after, Laura woke up from her coma. When she realized she had only half an hour left, an overwhelming sense of fear washed over her. Carl woke up and saw that she was fine, but he couldn't help but laugh. The rich man finally felt what the poor man felt, seeing that the time on his arm was not far from death. Now must get to the time. The two of them ran for it. At this moment, Carl thought of his friend Jack. A few days ago, he gave his friend 10 years of time, just when they thought they were saved. Jack's wife told them that Jack was dead, and all that time had been spent on booze, and blamed Carl for not giving him so much time. Now the two men were desperate. Now they have only a few minutes left. And then, in the nick of time, Carl suddenly found Laura's diamond earrings. He immediately dragged Laura to a nearby pawnshop. The owner saw that they only had 1 minute left. He said that they could only exchange it for 2 days. Laura was furious, but now is not the time to argue, so she agreed. But this is not enough time. After thinking about it for a while, Carl called Laura's father and threatened to give him 1,000 years to get his daughter back and deliver her to a designated bank. But the man hesitated. It wasn't that he couldn't afford 1,000 years. He thought his daughter had turned traitor. Afterwards, they went to the day room where Carl used to live. Laura changed into Carl's mother's clothes. They talked. During this time, Laura learned a lot about the ghetto and what happened to Carl's mother. Maybe she felt the same way. She no longer hated the man in front of her. She had come to love him. The next day, they found out that the bank they'd appointed wasn't available. Laura felt an indescribable loss. Apparently, she didn't mean as much to her father as she thought she did. Carl was afraid she would be upset and said that the sheriff might have prevented it. Laura just smiled. She knew her father's character too well. It's not surprising that he would do such a thing. After a fierce battle of ideas, Carl decided to let Laura go back. It was too dangerous to follow her. Before leaving, he handed Laura a pistol for protection. Seeing that he cared so much about himself, Laura gave Carl a big kiss. Then she called her father and blamed him. When she found out that the police had found out where they were, Laura saw the sheriff pointing a gun at Carl. In the nick of time, she shot the sheriff in the arm. Carl escaped with his life. They took the police car. Carl was afraid the sheriff would die on the road. He didn't hesitate to give him a few hours. Everyone in the area hated this uncaring profession. By now he was a street rat. Everyone was taunting and berating him. Laura saw the clock ticking down. She began to blame Carl for giving time to the sheriff, but Carl said he'd be dead on the road if he didn't. And Laura finally understood his good side. With less and less time on her hands, Laura didn't know what to do. In this moment of life and death, Carl had no choice but to put morality behind him. Out in the field, he hailed a cab. There was a rich girl in it. Carl was talking to her. Laura shot the cab. It was a shocking sight for Carl. Then the woman got out of the cab, but they only needed a day. The woman was surprised. Carl said that 1 day was enough. He looked at the woman's earrings. The woman had the good sense to take them off. Laura didn't think it was necessary, but she took the earring anyway. It's not safe to drive around in a police car, so they chose to take a cab. In the shade of a tree in the middle of nowhere, the two saw the wanted news in the car. Laura was wanted for shooting the sheriff. We can't keep running like this. They had to find a way to fight back. The next day, the two of them drove a truck straight into the bank. They started loading the time storage device with boxes. People heard the sirens and came rushing in. Laura was generous enough to share the time with them. Carl snuck 10 years of storage to his best friend's wife, and then he gave it to a homeless girl in her sleep. In just a few days, the two robbed 6 banks. A lot of time went into the ghetto. Unbeknownst to them, an even greater danger was on the horizon. The father saw his bank being robbed by his daughter. He couldn't believe she was doing this, but the mother told him the truth. This is all because of you. At night, Carl took Laura to a hotel. They played poker. Whoever loses takes off his clothes. They were just about to fall asleep. Suddenly there was a noise outside. Through the window, Carl spotted the police station. They wanted to leave secretly, but they didn't realize that they had already entered the building. Carl had to jump out the window to escape, but this time the police chief was determined to catch him. He also jumped down from the second floor. Seeing the situation is getting more and more critical, Carl had to take Laura and run as fast as he could. He managed to get on a bus, but the driver recognized them as wanted criminals. But Carl did not panic. He gave them 10 years. The driver stepped on the gas. The two of them were lucky to escape. But then the time bandits got to Carl. They forced the poor recipients of the donation to tell them where they were, or they would kill them all. On the other hand, Carl was checking into a hotel. On his way up the stairs, he was spotted by a customer. He sold the location to the time bandits for 30 days. Soon after, the time bandits' boss stormed into Carl's room. He offered a duel for time. Carl knew he could win or lose. He could only agree to his opponent's request. Seeing that the time bandit boss was going to lose, his men tried to help him. Carl took the opportunity to pull out his gun. He killed them in minutes. The time on the boss's arm had turned to 0. He died after a few violent convulsions. When the hotel owner heard the gunshot, he called the police, but when the police arrived, only found a few cold corpses. At this moment, Carl brought Laura to a rooftop. The noise outside attracted their attention. It turned out that the bank's interest rate had risen by half. Although they have been robbing a lot of time these days, but it still can't change the lives of the lower class. The fate of the poor will always be controlled by the rich. Want to change the status quo, unless they can grab a million years of time. Seeing the angry Carl, Laura had an idea. The next day they went to the biggest bank in the rich neighborhood, with Laura attracting her father's attention. Carl took advantage of the situation to infiltrate the bodyguards. He soon took the man hostage. They led him all the way to the vault. Laura guessed the combination to the vault. The moment they opened the vault, they were shocked. There was really a million years of time, and the father knew what his daughter was up to. He advised her not to do anything foolish. Even if she gave all the time to the poor, it would only be a temporary relief. One day the world will be the same again, because human nature is greedy. Everyone wants to live forever. Most of them will naturally fall victim to it. Carl was furious. His own mother was the very victim the man was talking about. He had to break the rules. As soon as Carl left, the alarm went off at the police station. They realized a million years were missing from the rich neighborhood. They took action immediately. Carl's car came into view. The sheriff rushed after him. He told his men to shoot the car. Unbeknownst to them, Carl was driving Laura's father's bulletproof car. In a hail of bullets, they broke through the barriers. They finally made it to the ghetto, quickly handing over the time to the children who came to meet them. And so a million years of time flowed into the ghetto. At that moment, the sheriff caught up with them. In order to buy time for the people in the ghetto, Carl pretended to raise his hands to surrender. The sheriff thought he had him, but the crowd swarmed around him. Carl took the opportunity to escape with Laura. The two of them ran for their lives, but in the end, they couldn't escape the sheriff. They were running out of time. Carl had no choice but to surrender, and asked the sheriff for some time. He was sure he wouldn't let him die so easily, and so the sheriff agreed. But then he remembered something. Just now, he had been thinking about arresting people. I forgot to collect the time. When he saw that there were only 5 seconds left, the sheriff's mind went blank. Carl and Laura were running out of time, but they knew the sheriff had a spare time in his car. They ran for the car as fast as they could. Carl got the time from the car first, and then he made a mad dash for Laura. It was like deja vu all over again, but this time he managed to save her. Together, they had less than 2 days, but they could do enough romantic things. Since 100 years have passed into the slums, the factories have been shutting down. They've gone to the rich neighborhoods. By the end of the movie, Carl is planning to rob the next bank. The Time Project was released in 2011. It's a little ahead of its time, but many of the details are true to real life.